whoever will succeed Mikko will start from the beginning of next year. But the decision tomorrow, yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, can I ask you to take your seats, please? Very well, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to channel the spirit of John Bercow if you don't be quiet and start shouting, "Order! Order!" Thank you, and welcome back. I hope you're suitably refreshed, stimulated after the coffee break. So we move our agenda on to circular economy. After a fascinating set of insights with Commissioner Moedas this morning, we've talked about the past, and now the agenda for the conference is going to shift a little more from the past and a transition towards the future. And what we can expect from Horizon Europe, the ambitions that will be set through the strategic planning process, and what some of the headline priorities are in science, technology, and innovation for the European Union, its member states, and all of the key actors in the R&I landscape to start moving us towards these long-term strategic impact objectives. So circular economy. You probably know it's been at the heart of a number of strategic EU goals in the last few years, but perhaps has been a little marginalized or sidelined. We haven't heard so much about circular economy in the last couple of years, despite the fact that the Commission has been working very diligently on its action plan for the last 5 years. I think in the report from the Commission to the Council and the Parliament only a couple of months ago, they report 147 billion euros in added value for the work that's been done to date, and 17 billion in terms of investments into circular economy innovation. So we have great foundations, but what will happen to them? What will be built on them? And that's what essentially we're going to discuss in the next hour. How far have we come? Where are we going? And how are we going to get there? So to support this discussion, we have 4 esteemed, eminent guests who I'd now like to invite to come up and join me on stage, with a lot of patience for Vice President Katainen, who has a tennis injury. So we'll invite you to make your way onto the stage, and I will just briefly introduce our panel. First, Vice President Jyrki Katainen, Vice President for Jobs, Growth, Investment and Competitiveness, and the champion of the circular economy in Europe in the last few years. Actually, Mr. Katainen, yeah, if you like that. Second, Peter Lacy, Global Managing Director of Accenture Growth and Strategy and Global Sustainability Lead. Third, Shiva Dustdar, Head of Division Innovation Finance Advisory at the European Investment Bank. And last but not least, Aart de Geus, Chair of the Executive Board of the Bertelsmann Foundation and the Supervisory Board at Triodos Bank. So, we will follow a similar format to this morning. And we will start with Vice President Katainen to give us an update on where we are today, the state of the art. So, please, Mr. Katainen, give us a quick overview on what you think have been the headline accomplishments around circular economy in the last Commission. And after that, we're going to come to your frustrations and things that have not been done. But let's start with the good news. Tell us a bit about where we are today.
Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. 5 years ago, when we started with this commission, circular economy was just a marginal phenomena, at least in the commission. But it's not that widely discussed in the outside world neither. So this has changed, and this big change is the biggest achievement what I want to mention first, because circular economy is not only environmental policy tool, but it's a profound, or it's very strong part of our single market strategy. Because there is no circular economy without well-functioning market. So that's why circular economy is part of our single market project. Also, circular economy is one of the main area when we design, or when we have designed industrial policy. So it has been incorporated to different policy areas, because we believe that there are two mega trends in the world economy in coming years. The first one is circular economy, and the second one is artificial intelligence. The two will shape our societies and market and business and working life and everything the most, we believe. Just to be a little bit more concrete, what we have done, we have had the first version of circular economy action plan consisting 54 concrete actions, and they all have been adopted or implemented already. But it is just the first touch to the topic. It has included fertilizers regulation, which will promote organic fertilizers into market. We have introduced a new waste package, which will force member states to recycle waste much better than they do at the moment. We have introduced a new plastics strategy, and all this has been done together with private sector, because circular economy is the sophisticated version of market economy. It's not a greenwashing program, neither second best in terms of productivity of profit making. It's a new version, more sophisticated, more sustainable version of market economy. That's why we have to, whatever the Commission do, we have to make it together with stakeholders, including private sector, because we need to design our policies right.
So if I'm correct, I mean, the 54 actions in the original plan have either all been accomplished or are in the process of being accomplished, which is remarkable, actually. Yeah. And I'm sure there have been plenty of whips being applied to the policy officers back to move the agenda forward. But from a leadership perspective, what was it that kept you awake at night, or your greatest frustrations, the barriers to progress that you, if you could wave a magic wand, you would have been able to unblock a lot more progress in the last 5 years?
Well, the biggest source of frustration comes from the fact that less than 12% of all material which we use in the European Union can be called recycled. So can you imagine, only 12% of materials are recycled. So at the same time, when it's frustrating, it enthusiasts me a lot, because everybody can see the potential. So we can gradually increase the amount of material which is recycled by using eco-design policies, by creating more favorable regulatory environment for recycling businesses. But here the eco-design plays a great role. One of the things which I'm personally very enthusiastic about is the work what we have already been doing, but the next Commission will accomplish it, is to create quality standards for packaging plastics. Because currently there are plenty of qualities in plastics, and we cannot recycle plastics as much as we want it, because you cannot mix different qualities with each other. So once we manage to create a European standard for packaging plastic, it will explode the packaging plastic recycling. And this is just one of the examples of the policies what we have been doing. So even though there are things which may frustrate people, but I still believe that there are more opportunities, and I'm so enthusiastic with this. One of the beauty of this this work, what we have been doing, is that the other markets are following very carefully what we are doing. China and Japan, for instance, are very interested in this standardization job because they would like to adopt the same standard as what we have once we have managed to do it right.
So in that context, has your experience been, particularly vis-a-vis the member states, more carrot, less stick, more stick, less carrot? Has it been a difficult experience to bring national agendas along with the European ambitions in circular economy and industrial policy?
There are certain areas where public authorities' decisions are needed in member states. For instance, when we talk about the recycling of municipality waste, but and there are countries who do it well already, and there are those who have not even started. But now we have binding legislation in place. So now we don't ask anymore from the member states whether you want to recycle material more or not, because there is a binding European law which we can enforce. And now, although also those member states who have not been that advanced yet must implement the new legislation. But I would say that the biggest drivers behind the circular economy development are the business itself, because in many countries industry has understood that if they want to improve productivity and profit-making capacity, they have to change the business model. So the role of public sector is not the most important in national level, but what business is doing, it's even more important. And then another very important factor or driver is the consumer expectation. So consumers are kings. They are demanding much more from companies, but also from the local authorities. So those are the two most remarkable factors, and we as a European regulator must understand what to regulate, what not to regulate, and how to regulate, because we cannot get a properly functioning circular economy if it's only local or national. We need at least European-wide playing field for those who want to change their business models.
So we're going to move to the business model question in a minute or so with Peter, and I think the consumer, the engagement of communities in circular economy will come up a little later, but perhaps you could share your thoughts then on what your recommendations would be for the next Commission. There are lots of regulatory and legislative blocks on which to build, existing statutes which will continue into the next policy cycle. But when you say we need to learn how to regulate, what do you think the priorities are for the incoming Commission? What should be top of the inbox?
One concrete issue which I hope the next Commission would conclude is to create taxonomy for sustainable financing. We have been working on this, and there is a public consultation going on ending 13th of September, and after that Commission will draw conclusions. So this is one of the single biggest piece of legislation or decision which will have a tremendous impact to sustainability, because financial sector, many banks and other financial institutions have demanded European interpretation what is sustainable and what is not. And now we are very close to make this classification. There are plenty of labels or classifications in the market, but consumers and investors are a little bit confused because there are too many of them. And that's why they have said that it would be extremely helpful if there was a European-wide taxonomy. And I do hope that the next Commission would put emphasis on that, because it's low-hanging fruit, though not easy to make, but it would have a tremendous impact to the sustainability. And I'm pretty sure that if we manage to get it right, the other markets would follow suit. So the European standard would become a global standard. Then just a processual observation. I do hope that the next Commission also uses the same method as what we have done, that you have to do this change from linear to circular together with stakeholders. because even though there are lots of talent in the Commission, but not all the talent lives in Bertelsmann. So there are lots of talents here, for instance, or there. So we really need to include all the relevant stakeholders in order to make a big shift towards the circular economy.
Thank you. Well, I think that's a very suitable and apt moment to hear from the industry side. So Peter and I actually go back many years. He was my first boss when I came to Brussels, so I know legitimately that he's been a real thought leader about sustainable development in the context of industry.
I'm not your boss anymore, so you can tell the truth. You can tell the truth now.
Well, you can tell us some truths about where we are from a business perspective, because we hear a limited number of case studies about companies such as Philips. We had Hans Hofstraat here this morning, who have really established circularity as part of their global brand and their positioning in the market. Yeah. But I think from Accenture's perspective, there's a lot more going on. Your book, Waste to Wealth, not only goes into the value case, the untapped, the unlocked potential for the shift to circularity, but also who's doing it that's possibly off the radar screen. So tell us a bit about what you see as the state of the art in the business world.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think Commissioner Katainen actually started it in the same place I would start it, actually, which is that there has been phenomenal progress in the last 5 years on circular economy, both across the policy agenda, which the European Commission has led, but also, I think, in business, and you mentioned Philips, but many others. So when we wrote the first book, Waste to Wealth, which at the time was, I think, I hope it was a useful contribution in trying to move circular economy away from simply being an industrial engineering concept, an environmental concept, or even a macroeconomic concept, to try and translate that into the microeconomics of how business translates circular into business models. And we looked at 5 different business models, and importantly, how those models are enabled by new technologies. And so when you ask about the state of the art for me, what I would say is that over the course of those 5 years, at the time when we looked at this, a lot of those models were nascent, were early stage. And 5 years later, what we've seen is that across industries, across geographies, we've seen that actually we're starting to see momentum and scale building. Even at the level, just very rudimentary maths, when we started off, we looked at 6,000 companies and managed to find 120 where we felt confident that they were creating competitive advantage in a more traditional sense of financial value and real circular economy impact. And that's what we based that particular book on. 5 years later, we were able to look at more than 1,200 case studies, many of them that we'd built up in the World Economic Forum's Circulars Awards over the period. And so I think it's more widespread, it's more pervasive, it's having more impact. So that's the first thing I think to say, and that's true across industries, geographies, and beyond that. I would say the second thing, and I think that's where it's highly relevant for an audience like this that's looking at the next generation of the research and innovation and policy agenda, is to ask the question, as part of what's the state of the art, why is that change happening? Right? And on the one hand, you can say, well, look, it's the demand that's being driven by customers, by voters and others who are looking at the situations that we find ourselves in around the world and the relationship between resources and the global economy. But actually, I think there's a fundamentally different lens on this, which is that we've had those pressures for a long time, and we've known about the principles of circular economy for a very long time. And what's making things possible that weren't possible before is this extraordinary cross-section of fourth industrial revolution technologies across digital, biological, and physical breakthroughs in science and engineering and the like. So, whether or not that's biomaterials that we can recover and recycle, whether or not that is the set of technologies that are revolutionizing what in Germany we call Industry 4.0, that are actually modular design, that are allowing us to track and trace materials through value chains and to be able to recover and recycle and reuse them, or whether or not it is the more physical shifts from fossil fuel-based materials and energy to renewables. All of those are the things that are enabling us to think differently about closing the loops and moving from linear to circular value chains. And so I think the fact that we have ahead of us 10 years where the pace and scale of change in those technologies is going to advance, you mentioned artificial intelligence as just one of those, I think is really auspicious. So the question for us in a policy, a business, and a research sense is how do we arc that curve of change so that you arc those technologies and circular economy principles together, while, and I think this is the final thing I'll say, is while also exploring far more extensively and fundamentally the link between those trends and productivity, jobs, and growth. Because that is something I think it's fair to say that we still don't know enough about. We know circular economy drives resource productivity in the economy, for sure, but the relationship with jobs and growth and some of the nuances there, I think we do need to explore more over the next 5 years in terms of research.
Okay, well, thank you for that, Peter. I mean, I think a perennial challenge within the broader European policy context is how to scale, right? And how we make breakthrough technologies, we make digital tools and skills. And I think in this particular context, business model innovation or business model transition tools available to enough organizations that this can start to happen at scale.
Yes.
So how do we do that, do you think? How do we get beyond the industry champions who are starting to adopt and embed these practices and processes and have the resources to bring in artificial intelligence technologies at scale? How do we trickle that down value chains so that everybody can benefit?
Well, I think the very obvious question is I finished the second book last week, so it's buy the book. I mean, that's definitely the first thing in terms of the trickle down. No, look, on a serious note, I think one of the most powerful ways that so I'll give you two answers. Right? So one answer is that although we often get very misty-eyed about small and medium-sized enterprises in policy settings and everyone gets very excited and it becomes the only focus, right? Actually still the Global 2000 corporations are the corporations that set the tone and the framework for most of the global value chains. So the small and medium-sized enterprises fit within those larger global value chains as suppliers, as distributors, as different parts of those value chains. So the tone is still set by those Global 2000. And so I think, as those companies move towards the 5 different business models that we talk about, products as a service, recovery and recycling, product life extension, sharing economy models, and circular supply chains, circular supplies, as we move to those, what we need to see is more knowledge sharing and more diffusion and more incentives built into those value chains that allow them to move from circular to linear. And so I think, I think it's part of it. I think the Commission has played a very important role in some of the standardization that it's done, but I think we can do more around the world. But I think that's the first thing, is setting the tone in the global companies and working with their supply chains, the first one. Second thing is what we've found, and Commissioner Katainen has been involved in this as well, we set up something called the Platform for Accelerating the Circular Economy. Shiva, you've been involved in that as well, with the World Economic Forum and with 70 different actors, including 11 funders, lots of multinational companies. Philips has been very involved in that. France, the CEO has chaired that network. In order to create what we've called, so essentially to create sandboxes, policy and business sandboxes around the world. I don't know if you've heard of that concept, I suspect you have, but the idea being that there are so many myriad nuances and complexities to closing loops in value chains that we're going to need totally new forms of regulation and policy and incentives, as well as different forms of business behaviors, FDI, investments and the like. And so what we need is almost these clusters of innovation around the world that we can connect together, but that are where actually people are prepared to be revolutionary and open up, the art of the possible in terms of policy and business. And so those kinds of networks that can go far further, far faster because of their sort of slightly smaller scale, but then can have that innovation replicated and augmented outside of that once we've worked out how to do certain things in closing loops. That's very important, I think.
Fantastic. And I think actually that's an extremely valid point in the context of the international/open to the world agenda to carry forward from this Commission into the next in Horizon Europe. Okay, well, you've referenced incentives. Who better to turn to than the bank in terms of incentives? So Shiva, I mean, the European Investment Bank, again, within the broader international financing landscape, I think has been a long-standing pioneer and champion, ahead of the World Bank, ahead of international development funds. So you've got skin in the game, literally, and a track record of success. So where do you see the investment and financing agenda going forward, if we're going to accelerate this transition from linear to circular in the next 5-10 years? And of course, once you've shared some initial thoughts, if anybody else wishes to comment or chip in on that, please feel free to. But Shiva, first, tell us what EIB's thoughts are.
Thank you very much. And again, not to be too repetitive, but I think it is actually important at this juncture to go back the last 5 years. And I think for the EIB, it's been a journey that we really have shared with the European Commission, really hand in hand. It started in some ways with also advisory of the EIB, looking at it in 2014-15. It was it seemed like a labeling exercise because the bank had done resource efficiency project, waste management, investments. But actually it went deeper. When we looked at the circular economy and the financing of circular economy, we realized that indeed we had not really understood exactly what it meant. That it entails a systematic rethink, a mindset change, a circular mindset as very often it is referred to. What I think was pivotal for the EIB and I would say the Commission is it was at the beginning of the Innofin program. And we realized that the eligibility of Innofin at that time was looking at product innovation, process innovation, but had not looked at business model innovation. And it was there where the European Commission actually was, I have to give them enough credit for the sort of very prompt reactivity or reaction of changing, modifying the eligibility criteria early on at the Luxembourg Presidency Conference in December of 2015 to broaden it to business model innovation, because that actually really gave us even better tools. And it was also through this actual collaboration with the private sector, with what the European Commission and started through a circular economy platform. It really helped also the bank to, that was a sort of stimulating exercise to help us go into our lending criteria and see what does it take as a bank to actually now invest into this. So very basic concepts like collateral. If you move from an ownership model to a service model, there are really huge ramifications. Now, it is an exercise that obviously still needs to be further and further refined. But I would say 5 years ago, when you ask our colleagues in risk management, have you ever thought of the linear versus circular risks? They thought you are, they really didn't know what you were talking about. I think now people are looking at it in a much more, I would say, educated way. But of course, we need to now, further develop it. So therefore, looking into the future, I think what it really now requires is this transversality of circular economy for us means that we need to, across all our lending priorities, whether it is innovation, infrastructure, SMEs, in climate, the embedding of circular economy across our projects is critical, meaning that when projects come to us, we are developing, and this is a work in progress, an instinctive reaction in our technical engineers, in our lawyers, in our bankers, in our risk managers. Is there opportunity for circularity here? And then also through advisory capacity, helping promoters to bring that into their project, because I think there are a lot of otherwise lost opportunities. So that is certainly one thing that I think is going to be very critical. And the third point is really the collaboration. I think circular economy requires both EU, national, public, private. So at those levels, we have just announced in July, this is our president together with the CEOs of the largest 5 promotional banks in Europe. So these are the KfW, CDCs, Italians, Spaniards, and Polish, jointly committing 10 billion in the next 5 years towards circular economy. Now, it's just the beginning. The fact that these CEOs have realized that it requires this sharing of experiences and committing jointly to such an important objective, I think is critical, because also EU national comes into it. I think what is very critical from a financing perspective is indeed our interaction with the banking community, the investor community, and there we are actively engaged in a network called Finance, where the CE at the end is circular economy. We thought that was very original for bankers, imaginative. Now, it is actually a forum where you have basically private commercial banks, you have investors, you have the European Investment Bank, you have the EBRD, meeting a few times a year and really flesh out what does it take for us to lend to circular projects. So this is in a snapshot the sort of things that need to all come together, and what it does mean for the EIB to meet our target of 3 billion in the next 5 years, which is again a target we hope to of course do more, but it's a very still lofty target, is that we do need to build on all of these initiatives that have now, as you say, served as foundation, but really scale it up.
Fantastic, thank you, Shiva. And I think we'll come back to a couple of these questions about incentives and building in circularity principles to lending protocols and instruments. But I think one of the broader questions that we've been discussing as a network, also with Kurt Vandenberger and colleagues at DG Research, is how are we going to actually measure impact? How are we going to track progress over the next 5 to 10 years? And one of the areas that's been suggested is, a close alignment with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, for example. But I'm going to turn to Aart, because you represent a bank on one hand, but primarily Bertelsmann as a thought leader and a foundation and a non-traditional actor in the research and innovation landscape. So how do you see this process of assessing how far we're going towards having circular economy in 2030 and the broader impact of research and innovation?
Thank you, Simon, for these kind words of introduction. It's an abstract thing, circular economy. So to make that understandable, to make it usable, a recipe of 3 points. Number one, internalize the Sustainable Development Goals. Embrace them. Wear the pin. Spread the news. This is the world future contract, agreed upon by all leaders internationally in 2015. Before that, it was not possible. After that, it will never be possible. We have it. It's a gift. Internalize it. Number two, set your objectives in measurable terms. Set your objectives in measurable terms, quantify them. Therefore, you can use the indicators that we have with the SDG. We publish as Bertelsmann Stiftung yearly this report where the countries stand, so you can see the progress, you can see where they are doing. You set your objectives according to these indicators. You choose them and you set your objective. It's worth it. I give you 2 examples. There is, one of the indicators is the percentage of women in engineering and science. What is that percentage? In Germany, it's lower than 25%. However, can you win the battle for the circular economy if half of your population, and nowadays it's the best educated part of the population, is not participating fully in this battle? However, can you win without unleashing the potential of women for the circular economy? So that indicator, you say, well, it has to go from 24 to 28 to 32 to 50%. Second indicator, municipal waste. You know what we produce as municipal non-recyclable waste? In Germany, it's more or less 5 times the weight of my body. So I'm 64 now, so what have I produced already? All these bodies in the room, in terms of weight, which is non-recyclable municipal weight. I put it up. Is this better?
Yes,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Still, I think this is incredible. This non-recyclable municipal weight that we produce. When you look at yourself in the mirror, today again, I continue to produce that. So set the objectives to reduce that. Third is include citizens in reaching these objectives. We are talking about politics, we are talking about business, we are talking about science, etc. If you don't include the citizens, then two things will happen. If you don't include citizens in the input, you will lose the legitimacy for the whole project. And you see on the political spectrum what can happen when you lose the commitment of citizens for your political projects. So include them in your panels, in your, as a business or as a political leader. I've been in politics. I always thought that politics was about an idea, then a law, and then a budget, and then it's done. Completely false. Of course, it's much more. You have to include citizens, you have to set objectives, and you have to measure and to follow up, business-wise. So business and politics can learn from each other. But that include the citizens in the input, but also include the citizens in the output. Make it clear for the citizens, what are these circular economy projects, what are you doing for them? So make the project local, let them share, let them celebrate. So include the citizens, and that is extremely important. Finally, consumers. Consumers are key. I have spoken with many business leaders who say, well, Aart, there is an avant-garde of business, the Peter Lacy's of this world. There's an avant-garde of business people who say we should go for the circular economy, but my consumers want me to produce this and that, and they want, if I don't deliver it for that price, they go to my competitor. So the consumers have to wake up and have to organize themselves, etc. We consume too much fuel, we consume too much plastic, we consume too much paper, we consume too much meat, even over lunch now, and we consume too much fashion. We buy shoes when we have maybe 25 pairs or 50 pairs already in our closet. The recipe is simple. Internalize the SDGs. In your heart, in your mind, use that gift. Number 2, make measurable targets. Quantify it. And number 3, include the citizens and also the citizens as a consumer. Be a responsible consumer.
Very good. That's a challenge for all of us, I think. but I think it raises it's a very valid question. I think it's an ongoing issue for the European Commission. How do we win the hearts and minds around issues like circular economy? Who's the Greta Thunberg of circular economy? My 15-year-old daughter goes on climate marches. She doesn't go on circular economy marches. And the question about influencing consumer behavior, we've had plenty of projects funded in the last framework program in Horizon 2020, but is it really delivering new insights? Are the research and innovation priorities directed in the right way? Right? Do we understand enough about how to actually change behaviors while also delivering the kind of infrastructural and industrial innovations at scale? Commissioner Katainen, what's your take on this? How do we make circular economy something that people embrace as well as see as a necessity in the years to come?
I think it's important to think that circular economy is a tool to address, for instance, climate change and make our economies more sustainable. You don't need to love circular economy if you don't want, but it's just a tool. I call it as an industrial arm of addressing climate change. So it's just a mechanism. And I may live in Pablo, but I find that there is big demand from consumer, from citizen side, that the production and the way of life is more sustainable. So there's never been more demand from us all than what I can see today. So it's a good basis. So you also mentioned research and science contribution to this. This of utmost importance because we have to allocate, for instance, Horizon Europe resources to circular economy purposes much more. Actually, we have already done quite a bit during the last couple of years, but once the Horizon Europe budget will be significantly bigger, I hope, I do hope that there will be bigger allocation for this kind of innovations and fundamental research covering the circular economy opportunities.
Peter, does that, I mean, Aart's comments about consumers, right, the resistance level within big industry, does this resonate with you as well? I mean, going beyond consumer goods, of course, who have been a lot of the pioneers in circulars.
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, I think the point is very well made. That if you ask consumers, rather than ask them what they want, you actually look at what they do when they're at the purchasing, point, and the decisions they make. You have price, availability, quality, and sustainability criteria, and still sustainability is not the primary for the majority of consumers. I think the response to that bit, I think, would be that it is valid. I think that what we're trying to do with the business models around circular is to try and avoid, in the same sense as it's an industrial arm, it's a commercial arm. You don't necessarily need to love circularity to buy a product that's recoverable or recyclable. If we come up with the right innovation and the right business models that allow it to be not only more circular but a better price at least the same quality and with the same levels of availability. I think if you start expecting consumers to make trade-offs on those things, you're going to be sorely disappointed. And so, beyond the margin, so you have to try and make it fit, real business models and real economies. I think that the one thing I would say, which I don't think I mentioned in the earlier points, so I think that the European Commission has done a very good job, actually. I mean, if you look at the regions around the world and the governments, the Commission has been a leader. And actually, we did name the Commission, and you picked up the award, Commissioner Katainen, as each year with the WEF, we nominate a government or a public body who've made a real difference on circular economy globally. And I think that's true. With the Commission, I think, put in place a very solid foundation. But again, for the research community, one thing that I don't think the Commission has done yet, and that Europe as a whole has done, is remember that it isn't just about recovering and recycling or switching out unsustainable linear models and linear materials. It is also, I think, about thinking about through how some of the new technologies like digital allow us to create business models that dematerialize value. So they, actually, you look at avoided waste or wasted capacity. For example, if you look at the average private automobile in Europe, the automotive industry going through phenomenal change at the moment with connected vehicles from a digital perspective, from autonomous vehicles, from the shift to electric vehicles. On average, the average individual user of an automotive vehicle is going to be using it between 4 and 8% of its life cycle. But think of the embedded materials in that car that are inefficient at the industrial scale for actually delivering what we want, which is moving people from one place to another. Right? And there are all sorts of examples where we need to have innovation and research, which isn't just about how to recover and recycle materials, but actually it's just how to eradicate materials, but to provide the consumer and the citizen with the same value as an outcome. And that's something that I think in the first round, I think the Commission's strength was more in the recovery and recycle of materials and the flows of materials around municipal industrial waste. I think if we really want to take advantage of this next wave of technology for Europe, I think it has to be in that eradication of waste and wasted capacity in the economy as well.
So for me, it raises an interesting question, which we can now sort of look to, if you like, private or non-financial lenders and investors like foundations, but also the big institutions like the EIB. Can we realistically build these kinds of incentives into lending programs and financial instruments? Or is it really dependent on what's happening within the research and development and innovation communities for these to sort of bubble up to a point where they're looking for financing. Can you be a driver of this?
I mean, if I may maybe briefly start, I mean, I think, if I may, we already have. And in fact, there is a circular bioeconomy investment platform that we are setting up jointly with the European Commission. It came out of studies that were done by Innofin Advisory on the bioeconomy and circular economy fund, realizing this touches really on what Aart was saying. The biggest risk for bioeconomy, bio-based industry projects not to get enough financing has actually been market risk. So it boils straight down to the consumer. A lot of these technologies require relatively large amount of financing just to get a pilot facility and demonstration facility going. We're talking sometimes 100 millions. Europe, unfortunately, has historically lost some of these great projects, these sort of at that stage, because we haven't been actually able to put the money into it. It's been not coming forth. The bioeconomy, the circular bioeconomy investment platform is actually targeting those type of projects so that we keep the technology, so that we can actually produce, biodegradable plastics and all these sort of things that would help us reduce the waste and make waste again a source of energy. The problem, a lot of it being market risk, is that if you can really drive consumer sentiment to actually demand the corporations to make their packaging better, that financing will follow much easier. So yes, we have developed incentives where the European Commission and the EIB and other public funders may be taking more risk so that it unlocks the financing. Having said that, I think, we hold as consumers the key to unlock a lot of the financing, the way we behave, and I hope that actually makes. And then on digital, I would just very briefly just say that in fact, this is really the opportunity for us in Europe, and I think, in my view, we have a thought leadership on CE globally in Europe compared to I would say to other parts, but on digital perhaps we don't, and this is where we can really use our thought leadership in CE and in climate change and help us sort of also bring it to the digital. So I think I fully second what Peter was saying earlier on the digital and CE.
In addition, I think money is not a problem. There's public money, there's private money, there's a lot of money. Actually, there's too much money, but that's another topic.
I'm not sure everybody in the room would agree with that from a personal perspective. But
no, but look at what the ECB is doing. Oh, okay. In Triodos Bank, Triodos is a European bank with branches in Netherlands, Belgium, France, Spain, UK, Germany. And we lend out for projects with a sustainable character. Now, the reason that we can be profitable is that we have the expertise about sustainability, so we have a better awareness of the risks with the projects, and if you have a better awareness of the risk, then you can make a sharper offer. So that's very simple. Mm-hmm. And then so this is our growth model, and we grow very fastly. Now, if money is not a problem, there are enough savers who want to give money for sustainable projects. Then what is the problem? Where's the bottleneck? I think indeed that is where it comes to the relation between business and consumers, more or less. But my hope is for the next generation. I think the next generation is more determined also to say, well, hey, what will our future be? But also, the young generation will not be more responsible in terms of consumption, but they will be more selective in where they work. Because the best and the brightest only want to work in companies with a mission. And if that mission is not related to a circular economy or to a sustainable world, then you will not get the best and the brightest. So my hope is for the next generation to achieve 2030 circular economy.
Fantastic. I think that's something we can all support. So we have 5 minutes left because we started just a couple of minutes late. you mentioned missions and next generation, and I'm going to sort of artificially shove those two together, because in about 15 minutes' time, we'll hear about the next generation of the College of Commissioners. And of course, missions have been touched on a little bit this morning with Commissioner Moedas as part of the way forward, right? A way of inclusive, co-created, ambitious, long-term projects of change and transition. Now, the devil is always in the details. So, Commissioner Katainen, what would be your advice for the next generation of commissions around the coordination of circular economy? It touches on so many areas, from grow to climate to education to research and innovation, etc. How do you think the new college can best coordinate this with research and innovation at the heart of how we're going to take this forward in support of industrial policy? What's your model for the future?
Well, actually, it's very easy to answer. I hope that somebody in the new commission would inherit my portfolio, because I've been in charge of coordinating the work of all the relevant DGs and commissioners when it comes to circular economy. So my title has been Vice President for Jobs, Growth, Investment and Competitiveness. And in my team, I have had 9 commissioners, for instance, agriculture, environment, single market, trade, research, etc. So all the relevant commissioners have been there, and we have been working very closely with each other. So that's why circular economy has not been anymore just a environmental issue, even though it's environment. But we have managed to bring it as a key element when designing industrial policy or single market policy, and we have managed to look at the natural resources from circular economy perspective. So I hope that the next commission would have somebody who has something similar as what we have had, somebody who is coordinating the work, because there is a huge risk that we sink back to the silo mentality, which is very easy. It's nobody's fault, but silos can be broken if somebody has a responsibility to coordinate the job.
Very good. So a final question to you all. We touched on missions. 4 out of the 5 first missions that have been proposed for Horizon Europe arguably have circular economy as a significant strand within them. But should we have a mission on circular economy for the next few years? Or is it important to just have it embedded in lots of interconnected areas? Your final thoughts?
I mean, so first thing I would say is...
Peter.
Oh, is that not working? The first thing I would say is I think that's exactly right, what Commissioner Katainen says. I think, of course, it's an environmental issue, but actually the more fundamental and more powerful way of framing it, which the Commission has done, is in that context of competitiveness, of industrial policy, of jobs and growth. That's where you get real scale, real impact, I think, across the economy. So that bit I think is to do. Now, your question about, I mean, that's a fundamental theory of change question, I think, that you're asking about how you go about structuring those kinds of missions. I'm not close enough to the European system to have a really powerful view, but what I will say, within corporate organizations, I think there's room for both approaches. So in other words, first and foremost, yes, it must absolutely be embedded right across the organization, into the way you think about supply chains, the way you think about design and product development, the way you think about marketing and communication and engaging with the consumer, the way you think about finance, the way you think about managing the risk of different business models in finance. So that's absolutely a given. I do think there is a role for a coordinating group where the whole adds up to more than the sum of the parts. So there are real efficiencies and needs to connect different parts of the organization, because mainstreaming it in silos still produces suboptimal outcomes. Right? So as a theory of change from organizations that I've seen really drive this, the answer is both. It's having it fully embedded across the spectrum, but also having a group or having a mechanism to be able to make sure that the whole adds up to more than the sum of the parts.
Terrific. Aart, Shiva, any final comments, briefly?
Yeah. Well, let me amend your question a little bit, because I think the bigger picture and the bigger story is not the most difficult part for well-qualified Europeans. It's much more a challenge to connect the program and the budget and everything you have to the glory of local citizens. So I would say, if you make your program, seek the glory of the locals. So if you have a program on energy reduction, make an alliance with a local football club in Bari, go there, and make it visible for the citizens. Or go to maybe Helsinki or Belfast. Make it visible for the citizens. And that is extremely important to make circular economy not just a very nice concept and a very nice policy, but something that we can share and that we can celebrate.
Well, I think on that we will celebrate what's been a very interesting discussion. Thank you for your contributions. I'm just going to give 1 minute of practical information and then we'll thank the panel for their time and insights this morning. So we transition from here to our breakout workshops. A quick recap, the artificial intelligence session will take place in this room. EIC, ground floor, new actors on the first floor, and the decarbonisation one on the second floor. Now, to remind you, you have coloured stickers on your badges if you signed up. My colleagues here have signs with coloured stickers on as well. So go to them, and they will lead you to your breakout rooms. But before you leave, order. Can we please take a moment to thank Vice President Katainen, Peter Lacy, Shiva Dustdar, and Aart de Geus.
Very good to see you. Yeah. Good luck with the